much, Charlie. I was really sympathetic to your approach of walking the city. If you work on Venice, as I do, and go there regularly, the first thing you discover is that you have to do a lot of walking. And so you're walking around something which is practically a museum piece. It is still lived in, it does have a life of its own, but unlike the examples you're describing of kind of material loss and destruction, it's still very much like with us physically. And for me, it's a question about how we can go beyond the tourist experience of Venice, go beyond this kind of conventional, monumental narratives recorded in its public history and the kind of things that you refer to as marquee events. And what I'm really trying to get access to is the kind of the voice and experience of ordinary people. And historians here know that this is often a goal of historians, and it's an extremely problematic one, seeing as they're obviously no longer with us. But again, I was sympathetic to the kind of things you were talking about Silvertown, the rubber factory, and the kind of popular experience. And it was these things that were really striking you in your experience of the material fabric. So when I'm walking in Venice and say I step outside the historical archive and there's a bridge there, and I know from my own work an insignificant man was arrested on the bridge in 1575. He was arrested for selling eggs without a license. Now this is a completely insignificant event, okay? But for me, this is a telling event that kind of brings that city to life. It's an important aspect of the way the markets of the city were structured and the way people experienced it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of work that I'm trying to do at the moment, because as Caroline said, I'm working on debt. So I'm interested in how people experience that market. Now, if you're a historian of debt, you can go and look at all of these amazing account books and contracts, and the notarial archives in Venice have tens of thousands of contracts that one could go through, and they're really boring. I wouldn't recommend it. What can we learn from these things? Economic historians have traditionally decided to try to quantify these kind of sources, so extract some numbers from them, build them in big old series, and try to plot change over time. Now, I'm not really interested in any of that. I'm interested in, well, what does the document represent? What are the human relations that underlie it? How is this document situated in a story? Because all of those elements that would really interest us, like how did he fall into debt, how did he end up signing this mortgage, what does it really mean for them, all of these things are stripped out of the document. This just preserves certain key facts for legal purposes. So it's an abstraction. It's an abstraction that permits the debt, in fact, to be monetized, transferred easily. It's for a completely different kind of function from that which the historian might be interested in. Fortunately, however, I have discovered other kinds of records, and they're records that attempt to contest the formal documentary record of contract and account, and these are records of fraud. Now, through an action for fraud, you could bring a case to the court and you could say, this contract is in fact a lie. It's rubbish, yeah? I never received the goods detailed. I was never paid the money. These goods didn't exist, or I never saw them, okay? This person in the contract is just a front man. There's a use of fictitious names, fictitious prices, fictitious commodities. And people are attempting through this to really try to undermine these contracts and tear them up. To do that, which is a challenge in law, the entire legal system is based on certifying these documents. So if you want to try to contest it, you have to present an alternative narrative, and that's where things get interesting for the historian. Because to contest the debt, people are going to have to explain their story. How did they get into debt? What does it mean? And we can learn some fantastic things about how a seemingly dual mortgage actually represents a long history of falling into debt, a relationship of exploitation, all kinds of fascinating aspects that kind of situate that transaction in lived experience. So this is the kind of thing that I'm trying to get out from this, kind of ordinary stories. Now, there's some really important points to note, like a problem with this documentation, in that these denunciations too are fictional in their way, that they too are creating not the truth, it's an alternative narrative. They're presenting their own version of a story. So we have to be pretty kind of cynical about the kind of things that are presented. I think what we end up with is not, you can never really get to a truth as such, but more kind of set of competing narratives that are being presented. And for me, that's something of the nature of city life, kind of contested set of stories fighting to occupy that space and establish a truth that will be accepted legally. So let's try to come back to the emphasis on space. What can we learn from these kind of sources about the way space and credit interact? One thing that I'm really struck by from these stories is the way that the credit market is so heavily segmented. That is to say, to access the market is very much a factor of who you know and what kind of information you possess and what kind of assets you have. And therefore, access to credit is very much an aspect of one's class experience. People will access it in radically different ways. And this in turn feeds into a sense of the segmentation of the city spatially, so that certain people will access it maybe out in the periphery. Let's imagine a peripheral neighbourhood of Venice. Okay, it may begin with women. Women have a particular role to play in this market. They can enter into the houses of other noble women. So if we imagine a noble wife who wants to borrow money for some purposes of her own that her husband isn't prepared to give her, okay, or doesn't have, okay, for her it's very difficult to go out of the palace. Women's movement is very strictly controlled, particularly for elite women. So where will she begin? With other local women of the neighbourhood. They have the ability to enter into her palace, contract with her. These women are not the people who are going to lend her the money, they're just intermediaries. They are the kind of the glue in the system, connecting isolated people in households to the markets. They'll go out to key nodes in the system, which have managed to identify particular kinds of shops. So, goldsmiths, jewellers, second-hand clothing dealers. These are people who don't just retail new products, but play a really key role in the credit market of taking in people's material objects as pledges for loans, raising money on them, or selling them second-hand. So the women are connecting the neighbourhood level to the shops, and the shops in turn are connected out to other kinds of credit markets. So connecting to the ghetto in Venice, the Jewish community is itself spatially segregated, and this is where you can also access a certain form of credit lending, or other key sites such as around the prisons in town. Why are the prisons so important? Because so many prisoners who end up there are really desperate for money in order to fund their time in prison. You have to pay your own way in the cells. So they're people who really need money. As a result, around the prisons cluster a whole load of credit providers. So we can see spatially there's all kinds of interesting ways in which different areas of the city connect as a function of a network connecting the different classes and social groups together. So that's what I've been trying to bring out in my work, is to try to explore people's experience through the narratives that they construct, the stories that they tell about how they got into debt and how that was negotiated, and thinking about how that is an aspect of class and power, and can kind of bring that city to life for us. And that's really the aim of what I'm trying to do, is not to have a really dull economic history, but one which is really embedded into people's social and cultural existence. And so for me, this is a way of bringing the city to life with a set of very different stories. I'll finish there for now. you.